This story happened in December 1993. I remember how during the day a sharp northern wind picked up, and by the evening it had already become very cold. Early the next morning, I had to travel to the suburbs by bus on the very first route at 5 in the morning. To make it to the station on time, I had to leave the house very early. I walked to the tram stop and stopped at the road, waiting at a red traffic light. There were no cars on the road yet. Not far from me, two drunk men were loudly talking. Besides them, there wasn't a soul in sight. I kept my eyes on the traffic light so I wouldn't miss the green signal and shivered from the freezing cold. Suddenly, I heard a man scream to my right. I turned in that direction and saw a man running toward the two drunken passers-by, holding an axe in his hands. His head was bare. He was wearing some thin jacket that wasn't suited for the season, trousers, and completely bare feet. Swinging the axe ferociously, this modern-day Viking struck the forehead of the nearest man. The man grabbed his head after the blow and fell to the ground. The second man jumped back in fear, but the madman charged at him. Swinging once again, he tried to strike the second victim in the head as well. However, the man managed to put his hand forward, and the dangerous axe injured it. The victim cried out in pain, pulling his wounded hand back, but the furious attacker didn't hesitate and struck him in the head again. He too collapsed onto the snow. Then the murderer looked in my direction and started running toward me. My legs immediately sprang into action, and I ran onto the road while the traffic light was still red, not paying attention to the street. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a single headlight from a car that was about to hit me. The brakes screeched, and I felt a slight touch on my back. Then there was a dull thud and a man's scream. After crossing the road, I turned around. My pursuer was lying unconscious on the street, his weapon lying next to him. Not far away stood an old minivan. The driver's door opened, and the driver got out of the van and approached the pedestrian he had hit. He didn't pay any attention to me. Shaking from stress, I didn't wait to see what would happen next and ran toward the tram stop. I was lucky enough to catch the tram that had just arrived at the stop. I got on and safely escaped, heading to the station and then to the suburbs. I spent the entire day trembling from the fear I had experienced. I didn't even eat once during my long work shift. That evening, as darkness fell, I returned home. I didn't tell anyone about the incident, wondering if the police would come looking for me. But no one from law enforcement ever bothered me. However, not long after, I read an article in our local newspaper. It said that early in the morning, a mentally ill man, registered at a psychiatric hospital, had attacked two passers-by with the intent to kill them using an axe. Fortunately, both victims survived. The ambulance and police were called to the scene by the driver of the minivan, who had accidentally hit the attacker on the road while the criminal was chasing his third victim. The identity of this person, the third victim, has not yet been established. Therefore, the police are asking him to come forward and call 112. The attacker himself survived the accident and was taken along with his victims to the city hospital. But I didn't call. The most important thing is that those two men survived. As for me, I still shudder when I recall that story. It was summer in the early 2000s. One day in May, my mother-in-law and I were left home alone. My wife and daughter had gone to the Dhaka summer house that evening. I had to go to work on Saturday for some repair tasks. As for my mother-in-law, she wasn't feeling well, so she decided not to leave the city. Closer to midnight, I went to bed. My second mom had gone to lie down a bit earlier after taking some pills. And then, in the middle of the night, I felt, half asleep, that the door to my room was opening. At that time, we had a cat living with us, and I thought it was her. But when I opened my eyes, I saw my mother-in-law in her nightgown in the dark, approaching the wardrobe where my wife's dresses were hanging. Without paying any attention to me and without turning on the light, she silently opened the wardrobe doors and began looking for something inside. Believe me, in that moment, I felt terrified because the scene was clearly unsettling. The thought even crossed my mind that the old woman had lost her mind. But then, she suddenly stopped rummaging through my wife's clothes, turned around, and left the room in the same way, without paying any attention to me. In the darkness, I couldn't see her face to even roughly understand what was going on. I was too scared to call out to her, as I had a gut feeling that something sinister was happening. So I just lay in bed with anxiety, silently watching my mother-in-law. And then she suddenly started either whining or howling somewhere in the hallway. At that point, my nerves gave out. I quickly got out of bed and locked the door as fast as I could. Then I stood there nervously listening to the sounds, but everything went quiet. I was too scared to step out into the hallway since I had no idea what was happening with my mother-in-law. In my imagination, I pictured that a demon had possessed the old woman during the night, and she had become its vessel. Although, on the other hand, the walls in her room were covered with icons. The clock showed it was already 2 in the morning. Suddenly, our cat started rattling her litter box in the bathroom. Then she began scratching as usual, instinctively trying to bury her waist. At that moment, a thought flashed through my mind. If the cat was acting calmly, then nothing paranormal was happening in the apartment. After all, animals can sense the presence of otherworldly forces and react to them. And yet, our cat was calm. So maybe my mother-in-law wasn't possessed by dark entities after all. However, I still couldn't bring myself to step out of my room until dawn. Only in the morning did I go to investigate. The apartment and my mother-in-law's room were peaceful. I stood near her bedroom door but didn't dare knock. After all, who knows what had really happened to her? To avoid making any noise, I didn't even wash up or have breakfast. I quietly left the house and headed to work. All through my shift at the factory, I couldn't stop thinking about that night's strange adventure. A thought came to my mind. Perhaps I had witnessed a sleepwalking episode from my mother-in-law. She's already an elderly person, so she might suffer not only from cardiovascular issues, but also from neurological disorders. And yet, I got scared so foolishly, as if I had seen a living corpse rise from the grave right before my eyes. When I cautiously came home that evening, the old lady acted as usual, as if nothing had happened. She fed me dinner, and I kept watching her closely, trying to figure out whether she was just pretending to be an innocent lamb, or if she genuinely didn't know that she had roamed the apartment. But I noticed nothing suspicious in her behavior. The next night went by peacefully. This time I locked the door and couldn't fall asleep for a long time. But my mother-in-law didn't disturb me. I didn't tell either my wife or my mother-in-law about the incident, although I was curious about what exactly had happened. Fortunately, there were no further recurrences. A young woman was hired as a babysitter to watch the kids for the evening. After the parents left, she put the children to bed and went to the living room to watch TV. Suddenly, she heard a noise coming from the basement, as if the washing machine had started running. She wanted to go turn it off, but when she opened the door leading to the basement, the noise stopped. Shrugging, she went back to the living room and continued watching TV. 5 minutes later, the washing machine started running again. The girl got up, opened the basement door, and started walking down the stairs. She was just a few steps away from reaching the basement when the noise stopped again. She went back to the TV. 5 minutes later, she heard the washing machine start up again. This time, the girl got genuinely scared. She ran upstairs to the kids, quickly gathered them, and together they ran to the neighbor's house, where she called the police. A few minutes later, the police arrived and went down to the basement. They found a man hiding behind the washing machine. As it turned out later, he had been trying to lure the girl into the basement, though he refused to say what he had planned to do to her. We were walking to my house. We meant me and my classmate Jennifer. We had been walking for a long time. Climbing up the hills, our legs were trembling. There were many hills in Germany. We were trying to walk quickly, cautiously glancing around. The thing was, there was a crazy woman in our area who kidnapped and killed children. Rumor had it that she lost her mind after her children and husband died in a car crash. There's a theory that she had been infertile and poor, and after killing her husband, she started taking revenge on people by harming their children. Kids had gone missing, but not so often that it caused widespread panic. It wasn't clear whether this woman was truly involved in the disappearances. When we were already close to my house, I curiously looked at a burned-down house. I stopped and started examining it. I knew that the psychopath liked to hide and live in long-abandoned houses that people avoided. My friend looked at me in surprise and then also started examining the house. I shook my head and kept walking, chatting with Jennifer. But then, just 2 minutes later, I saw the crazy woman. She was dressed all in white, smiling with cracked lips and saying very strange things. "When I kill you, you'll become a part of me, and your soul will go to God, and you will be happy." I became terrified because very few people had ever managed to escape from this sick woman, and suddenly she grabbed us. Jennifer screamed and started struggling to get free, while I began hitting and biting her. Then I started scratching her face. The woman clutched her dirty, unattractive face with her bony hands and began screaming and hissing in a terrifying way. But she let us go. We ran away from her as fast as we could. 15 minutes later, we finally made it to my house. In talking over each other, we told my mom and the police everything, where it happened and what had happened to us. The next day, the authorities called and told us that they hadn't found the psychopath, but they did discover a white dress splattered with blood. I felt upset and started thinking. But later that evening, the scariest thing happened. While I was brushing my hair, I noticed that the very same woman was standing behind me. She was semi-transparent, with black holes where her eyes should have been, and a cruel smirk on her face. I held my breath and quickly turned around. The bathroom was empty. I was alone. But it was a shock. That all happened a month ago. I'm 12 years old and my friend is 11. Children are still disappearing, though less often. Nothing about this is written in the newspapers or reported on the news. The police are still looking for her, but I feel like she's a ghost, taking revenge on children for her death and her infertility. She's just an evil spirit. Since then, I've been taking the bus to school and back home, just in case my luck runs out.